I never thought, in a million years, that I'd be the kind of person to end up in a neighborhood feud. Especially not one involving the homeowners association. I'm Mark Johnson, a software developer who mostly works from home. I keep to myself, make sure my lawn is mowed, and generally try to be a decent neighbor. My house is in Oak Ridge Estates, a pleasant suburb with meticulously maintained properties and, unfortunately, an overzealous HOA board with way too much time on their hands. When I bought my house 3 years ago, everything seemed absolutely perfect. The previous owners had converted the garage into a fantastic home office with large windows, just perfect for my remote work setup. There was still enough space to park one car, with a detached carport in the back for a second vehicle. This arrangement worked flawlessly for me, until Karen Miller moved in next door and was elected to the HOA board a mere 6 months later. Karen, or Karen as I started to think of her in my head despite her insisting everyone call her Pat after introducing herself as Mrs. Miller, homeowner to the new residence, was in her mid-50s with a blonde bob haircut that seemed to get more aggressively angled with each passing week. She drove a pristine white Lexus SUV that was always impeccably clean and sported a personalized license plate that read PAT time. Every single time I saw that license plate, I couldn't help the involuntary eye roll that accompanied it. Our first minor clash happened when she complained about the small collection of succulents I had arranged on my front porch. Apparently, they weren't approved vegetation. I sighed internally but complied, moving them to my backyard, not wanting to rock the boat. The second issue arose when she claimed my garbage bins were visible from the street for 30 minutes too long after collection. Again, I adjusted my schedule, dragging them in earlier, desperately hoping that would be the end of it. But with Karen Miller, there was always something else. The color of my mailbox, the bird feeder in my backyard that was apparently attracting undesirable wildlife, the delivery packages that dared to sit on my porch while I was in meetings. Each infraction, no matter how insignificant, warranted a printed notice in my mailbox, a passive-aggressive text message, and occasionally an in-person visit where she would stand way too close and speak in the saccharine sweet tone that made my teeth grind. "Mark, honey," she'd purr, her eyes narrowed behind a forced smile, "we all have to follow the same rules. It's what keeps our property values high, you understand, don't you? I'm just doing my job as a board member." I maintained my composure through it all, addressing each ridiculous complaint while trying to minimize any interaction. My strategy was working reasonably well, until the carport incident. One rainy Tuesday morning, I was on a critical video call with clients when I heard a car horn blaring incessantly from my driveway. I tried my best to ignore it, my jaw clenched in frustration, but after a solid 5 minutes of that obnoxious honking, I had to excuse myself from the meeting, my professional demeanor cracking under the pressure. When I stepped outside, umbrella in hand, the rain was coming down in sheets. There, parked squarely under my carport, sat Karen in her pristine white Lexus, repeatedly slamming her hand on the horn while glaring daggers at me through her windshield. I approached cautiously, my temper simmering, and she rolled down her window just enough to speak, not wanting a single raindrop to sully her precious interior. "Mark, you need to move your car," she snapped, her voice tight with impatience. "I've been sitting out here getting soaked." I blinked in utter confusion, the rain pattering loudly on my umbrella. "I'm sorry, what?" "That's my carport." Karen actually rolled her eyes, as if I were the one being unreasonable. "The street is flooded near my driveway, and I didn't want to risk water damage to my car. Your carport was empty, so I assumed you wouldn't mind if I used it temporarily." I looked over, and indeed, my car was parked in the garage portion of my house because I had been bringing in groceries when the downpour started. The carport was temporarily empty, but that didn't make it public parking. "I'm in the middle of an important work call, Karen, and this is my property. You can't just park here without asking." Her face tightened, her perfectly applied lipstick seeming to thin with her rising anger. "Well, I'm asking now. Just move your car out of the garage so I can pull in there instead. The carport doesn't have walls, and rain is blowing in, The sheer audacity of her request left me momentarily speechless, my mouth agape. "No, Karen, I'm not moving my car. This is my property, and I need you to leave now." She glared at me for a solid 30 seconds, her eyes like chips of ice, before finally shifting her car into reverse. "I'll be speaking to the board about this. There should be emergency provisions for these situations. You're being very unreasonable, Mark." As she backed out, she deliberately swerved through a puddle, sending a wave of muddy water splashing all over my shoes and pants. I stood there, soaked and seething, watching her drive away. That evening, I received an email from the HOA with the subject line, "Proposed Amendment for Community Emergency Vehicle Accommodations," which would require residents with excess parking accommodations to make them available to neighbors during emergency weather events. Karen was listed as the contact person. I immediately forwarded the email to a lawyer friend, who confirmed what I already suspected: they couldn't legally force me to allow others to park on my property. She helped me draft a firm but polite response to the entire board, not just Karen, hoping that would finally put an end to this nonsense. It wasn't. The following weekend, I returned home from grocery shopping to find a white Lexus SUV parked in my garage. My actual garage, not the carport. The door was wide open, the vehicle was inside, and Karen was nowhere to be seen. I sat in my car for a moment, utterly dumbfounded, trying to process what I was seeing. How on earth had she gotten the garage door open? Then, it hit me like a ton of bricks. During a previous HOA inspection, she had asked for access to check some wiring that was supposedly visible from outside. I had foolishly given her the code to the exterior keypad, never in my wildest dreams thinking she would abuse it like this. There was a note taped to the interior garage door. It read, "Mark, had to attend an emergency board meeting. My driveway is being resealed today, and I couldn't park on the street because of the construction on Maple. Used your garage since you were out. Thanks for understanding. Pat." I stood there, the flimsy note clutched in my hand, unable to believe the level of entitlement. She had entered my property without permission, used my garage door code without authorization, and left her car in my space with nothing but a casual note, as if we were the best of friends with some prior arrangement. My blood boiled. I closed the garage door, went into my house, and immediately changed the code on the keypad. Then, I disabled the manual override button inside the house by removing its battery. Finally, my fingers trembling with rage, I texted Karen a simple message: "I see you parked in my garage without permission. The code has been changed. Please contact me when you return so we can discuss this breach of privacy." 3 hours later, my phone buzzed. "Mark, I need to get my car. Please open the garage." I waited a full 15 minutes before responding, my anger still simmering. "I'm in a meeting. I'll be free in an hour. In the future, please don't enter my property or use my garage without explicit permission." 10 minutes later, my doorbell started ringing incessantly. I checked the security camera to see Karen standing there, repeatedly jabbing the button while talking animatedly on her phone. I decided to let her wait a bit longer, a small measure of satisfaction washing over me. When I finally opened the door 30 minutes later, she had worked herself into a state of righteous indignation. Her face was flushed a dangerous shade of red, and she had been pacing on my porch for so long that there were visible tracks in the welcome mat. "This is completely unacceptable," she burst out before I could even utter a greeting. "I have been waiting for almost an hour. I have an important appointment, and you've essentially held my vehicle hostage. I could call the police for this." I maintained a calm demeanor, leaning slightly against the door frame, my voice dangerously low. "For what exactly? You entered my property without permission, used a security code that was provided for a specific, one-time purpose, and left your vehicle in my private garage without my consent. If anyone should be considering calling the authorities, it would be me. It was an emergency. My driveway is being resealed." "That's not an emergency, Karen," I said, my patience wearing thin. That scheduled maintenance that you knew about in advance and failed to plan for. You could have asked a friend to drop you off at your meeting or called a ride-sharing service. Just open the garage now. I'm already late. I shook my head slowly. We need to be clear about boundaries first. Do you understand that what you did was inappropriate and a violation of my privacy? She crossed her arms over her chest, her eyes blazing. You're blowing this way out of proportion. Neighbors help each other all the time. Help that is requested and agreed upon, yes. Not help that is taken without permission. I need you to acknowledge that you overstepped before I open that garage. Karen looked like she might spontaneously combust. Her face had turned a truly alarming shade of crimson, and I could almost see the steam coming out of her ears. For a woman who prided herself on maintaining control in the neighborhood, being held accountable was clearly a new and incredibly unwelcome experience. Fine, she finally hissed through clenched teeth, her voice dripping with resentment. I should have asked before using your garage. Now, will you please open it? It wasn't exactly a heartfelt apology, but it was probably the best I could realistically expect. I nodded curtly and reached for my phone to activate the garage door. And I'll need you to delete the old code from your phone. It won't work anymore, but I want to be sure you don't have it. She reluctantly pulled out her phone, opened her Notes app, and deleted something, showing me the screen with a triumphant little smirk. I then opened the garage door via my app. As the door lifted, Karen marched past me without another word, got into her Lexus, started the engine, and backed out with far more speed than was safe in a residential driveway. I watched, my arms crossed, as she drove away, tires squealing slightly around the corner. I foolishly thought that would be the end of it. But the next morning, I woke to find a menacing-looking notice from the HOA taped to my front door. According to the official-looking document, my home office conversion was non-compliant with current codes and would need to be restored to original garage functionality within 30 days. This was a direct attack, a blatant act of retaliation. The previous owners had obtained all necessary permits for the conversion, and I had all the documentation to prove it. The HOA had never raised this as an issue during my purchase or in the 3 years I had lived there. It was transparently vindictive. My lawyer confirmed what I already suspected: the HOA couldn't retroactively enforce a rule against a properly permitted conversion that had been previously approved. She drafted a strongly worded response letter, citing legal precedent and subtly hinting at potential legal action if they persisted with this harassment. That evening, I was still pondering this ridiculous situation when I heard a car pull into my driveway. I checked my security camera to find, unbelievably, Karen's white Lexus pulling into my garage again. The door was open because I had been bringing in yard tools earlier and hadn't yet closed it. I watched in utter disbelief as she parked, exited the vehicle, and walked out of the garage without even glancing toward my house. This time, there wasn't even a pathetic note, just a brazen assumption that my garage was available for her personal use. As I watched her walk down the street toward what I presumed was another self-important HOA meeting, a calm determination settled over me. If she wanted to play games, I could play too, but I would make absolutely sure to stay firmly within legal boundaries. I closed the garage door using my app and immediately drove to the hardware store. An hour later, I returned with a heavy-duty padlock and hasp. I installed the hasp on the interior of the garage door frame, effectively preventing it from being opened from the outside, regardless of what code was entered. I made absolutely sure the installation was secure but didn't damage the door itself in any way. Then, I sat down in my living room with a good book and a steaming cup of tea, positioning myself where I could clearly see the street through the window. Karen returned about 2 hours later. I watched, a grim satisfaction growing in my chest, as she approached my house, confidently punched the code on the keypad. Apparently, she had memorized the old one despite claiming to have deleted it from her phone, and then looked utterly bewildered when nothing happened. She tried again, her brow furrowed in confusion, then pulled out her phone, presumably to check if she had the right code. After a few more futile attempts, She stomped up to my front door and rang the bell, her finger practically glued to the button. I took my sweet time answering, counting slowly to 30 before finally opening the door with a look of mild surprise. "Karen, what can I do for you?" Her artificial smile was strained, barely reaching her narrowed eyes. "The garage door seems to be malfunctioning. I need to get my car." I raised my eyebrows, feigning innocence. "Your car? In my garage? Again? Without asking? After our very clear conversation yesterday?" Her smile faltered slightly, a flicker of annoyance crossing her face. "I was in a hurry, and you weren't home. I assumed it would be fine since the door was open. It's just for a few hours." "It's not fine, Karen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We literally just had this conversation about boundaries and respect for private property. You're trespassing, and you've once again taken something without my permission. Look, I don't have time for this. Just open the garage. The board meeting ran long, and I need to get home." "I've installed a manual lock on the inside of the door," I said calmly, gesturing vaguely behind me. "For security purposes, you understand." After finding unauthorized people repeatedly entering my garage, I felt it was absolutely necessary. Her eyes widened in disbelief, her mouth dropping open. "You locked my car in your garage? That's illegal. You can't hold my property hostage." "I secured my own property after repeated invasions of privacy," I corrected her, my voice unwavering. "Your unauthorized parking doesn't give you any rights here. But don't worry, I'll be happy to open it for you tomorrow morning around 9 a.m. Tomorrow morning?" She nearly shrieked, her voice hitting an ear-splitting pitch. "That's outrageous. I need my car now." "And I needed you to respect my property and privacy," I replied evenly, "but we don't always get what we need, do we?" I kept my voice deliberately level, refusing to be drawn into her hysteria. "You've left me countless ridiculous notices, filed petty complaints, tried to create new HOA rules targeting me specifically, and repeatedly entered my property without my permission. Consider this a natural consequence of your actions. I'll call the police," she threatened, pulling out her phone with a dramatic flourish. "Feel free," I replied with a shrug, my arms crossed. "I have security camera footage of you entering my garage without permission, documentation of our previous conversation where you acknowledged doing the same thing was inappropriate, and a lawyer on retainer who will be absolutely fascinated to hear about the pattern of harassment you've been engaging in. I'm sure the officers will be very interested in all of that." She stared at me, phone clutched in her hand, clearly calculating whether this was a bluff. After a tense moment that felt like an eternity, she slowly lowered the phone. "This isn't over," she said in a low, menacing voice, her eyes burning with fury. "The board will hear about this." "I'm sure they will," I replied calmly, "along with my lawyer, and possibly the local news if necessary. I've documented everything, Karen. Every notice, every text, every security footage clip of you entering my property without permission. If you want to escalate this, I'm prepared." Something in my tone, perhaps the utter lack of fear, must have conveyed my seriousness, because her expression shifted ever so slightly from pure rage to a flicker of uncertainty. She huffed, turned sharply on her heel, and stormed off down the street, presumably to call someone for a ride. The next morning, I woke up early, a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach, bracing myself for what would likely be another confrontational encounter. At precisely 9 a.m., I heard a car pull up outside. Looking through the window, I saw not just Karen, but also two other people I recognized from HOA board meetings, Walter Johnson, an older gentleman who had always seemed reasonable, and Sarah Miller, a newer resident who had recently joined the board. Karen had brought reinforcements. I took a deep breath, unlocked the interior padlock, and went to open the front door. The group was already approaching, with Karen in the lead, her face grim and determined. "Good morning," I said pleasantly, trying to project an air of calm confidence. "Right on time, I see." Karen completely ignored my greeting. These are board members who have come to witness the situation and ensure there are no further misunderstandings. I nodded calmly. Excellent. More witnesses are always helpful when documenting inappropriate behavior. I've already activated the garage door. Feel free to collect your illegally parked vehicle. The garage door was indeed slowly opening behind them. Walter and Sarah looked deeply uncomfortable, glancing nervously between Karen and me as if trying to gauge what exactly they had been dragged into. Walter stepped forward with an apologetic smile. Mark, Karen has shared some concerns about ongoing disputes. Perhaps we could sit down and discuss this like neighbors? I'm always open to reasonable discussion, I replied, my voice polite but firm. But just so everyone's clear on what we're discussing, Karen has repeatedly entered my property without my permission, used my garage without my consent, filed retaliatory complaints when called out on this behavior, and is now attempting to use HOA authority to continue this harassment. I have extensive documentation of all of this, which my lawyer is currently reviewing. Walter's eyebrows shot up, and he turned to Karen, his expression now one of concern. You parked in his garage without permission? More than once? Karen waved a dismissive hand, her face tight with anger. It was an emergency situation. He's blowing it completely out of proportion and retaliating by locking my car in. Actually, I interjected calmly, I secured my own property after repeated unauthorized entry. The fact that she had once again parked there without my permission is her responsibility, not mine. Sarah looked visibly troubled. Karen, you told us he had agreed to let you park there temporarily and then maliciously locked your car inside. That doesn't seem to match what I'm hearing. Karen's face flushed a deeper shade of red. He's twisting the situation. I left him a note the first time. A note is not permission, I pointed out, my voice steady, and there wasn't even a note this time. Just a blatant assumption that my property was available for her use. Walter cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on Karen. Karen, why don't you get your car, and then perhaps we should continue this discussion at the community center rather than in Mark's driveway. Karen looked like she wanted to argue, her jaw clenched, but instead, she marched stiffly to her now accessible vehicle and got in, slamming the door with unnecessary force. As she backed out, she nearly clipped Sarah, who had to step quickly aside to avoid being hit. That afternoon, I returned from a quick grocery run to find Karen's Lexus once again parked in my driveway. Not in the garage this time, but deliberately blocking access to it completely. This was beyond petty now. This was blatant, intentional harassment. I immediately took photos from multiple angles, carefully documenting the time and date, then called the non-emergency police line to report a vehicle obstructing my driveway. While waiting for an officer to arrive, I also called the towing company. Officer Jenkins arrived about 20 minutes later and listened carefully as I explained the entire situation, showing him the security footage of the previous incident and the meticulously kept documentation of Karen's escalating pattern of behavior. So, she's parked here to block your access deliberately after being told multiple times not to park on your property? He clarified, his brow furrowed in concern. That's correct, I confirmed, my voice tight with frustration. This appears to be escalating retaliation for me securing my garage to prevent unauthorized use. He nodded, making careful notes in his pad. I'll document this and speak with the vehicle owner. Officer Jenkins walked over to Karen's front door while I waited by my car, my anger slowly giving way to a weary resignation. I couldn't hear the conversation, but I could see Karen's animated gestures through her storm door, her hands flying as she undoubtedly tried to spin her version of events. The discussion lasted about 10 minutes before the officer returned to me. She claims there's been a misunderstanding about shared parking arrangements in the neighborhood, he said, his tone suggesting he didn't find this explanation particularly convincing. I've advised her to move her vehicle immediately and to refrain from parking on your property without explicit written permission in the future. I've also documented this incident, which should help if you need to establish a pattern of behavior. If the vehicle isn't moved within 15 minutes, you're within your rights to have it towed from your private property, he added, looking me directly in the eye. I've made that very clear to her as well. Karen emerged from her house 5 minutes later, shot me a venomous glare that could curdle milk, and stomped to her Lexus. She backed out with her usual complete disregard for safety and sped away down the street. The very next day, I received an official-looking envelope in my mailbox containing a notice of an emergency HOA meeting scheduled for the following evening, with parking violations and property use restrictions listed as the primary agenda item. Karen's signature was prominently displayed at the bottom. I attended the meeting, my lawyer by my side. When Karen saw us enter the community center, her expression was a fascinating mixture of surprise, raw anger, and a sliver of uncertainty. She launched into a dramatic presentation about community standards and certain hostile residents who were resistant to neighborhood cooperation. To Karen's visible dismay, I calmly distributed copies of my meticulously compiled documentation, clearly outlining her repeated trespassing and retaliatory actions. To my surprise, many other residents began to share their own stories of Karen's selective enforcement of rules, unprofessional and often rude interactions, and retaliatory notices issued after minor disagreements. What had clearly started as Karen's attempt to rally community support against me was rapidly turning into a referendum on her own appalling conduct as a board member. "This meeting is about parking violations, not personal grievances," she insisted, her voice rising to an almost hysterical pitch. "Actually, Karen," Walter interjected, his voice calm but carrying authority, "this meeting is about community concerns, which clearly extend far beyond parking." The meeting ultimately concluded with plans to thoroughly review the HOA's governance procedures. At the next official meeting, Karen was subsequently removed from the board, and Walter was elected as the new board president, promising to bring a more collaborative and reasonable approach to neighborhood governance. Karen listed her house for sale a mere 3 weeks later. The day she finally moved out, our eyes met briefly across the street. I raised my hand in a small, almost hesitant wave, acknowledging our shared, albeit tumultuous, history. She gave a tight, almost imperceptible nod before driving away in her white Lexus, still sporting that infuriation PAT time license plate. I never saw Karen Miller again, but her legacy lived on in a more balanced and fair HOA, in a neighborhood that had unexpectedly come together against petty tyranny. As for my garage, I removed the heavy-duty padlock, but I definitely kept the security cameras. Some lessons, especially those learned the hard way, are worth remembering, even long after the difficult teacher has finally moved on. The valuable lesson here is the importance of clearly defined boundaries and the necessity of standing up for your rights, even against seemingly powerful entities like a homeowners association or an overbearing neighbor. While it's crucial to be a good neighbor, it's equally important to protect your property and privacy from those who would seek to infringe upon them. Documenting every interaction and knowing your rights are essential tools in navigating such disputes. Sometimes, a firm but legally sound approach is the only way to resolve conflicts with individuals who lack respect for personal boundaries. What are your thoughts on this neighborhood feud? Have you ever experienced anything similar? Share your stories and advice in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, be sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more engaging content.